In 1974, at 84, Rose Kennedy sat for a camera crew in the house at Hyannis Port and talked about her children. She had been doing versions of this for decades. The diction precise, the anecdotes worn smooth, the answers arriving before the questions finished. That same period produced Times to Remember, the memoir she assembled from diaries she had kept since girlhood and from notes she had been making, on index cards and scraps of paper for most of her adult life. The book runs over 500 pages. It is warm, detailed, devout, and almost entirely without complaint. It gives the reader 9 children, a demanding husband, a great deal of travel, and a religious faith that absorbs whatever arrives. What it gives only briefly is her eldest daughter. Rosemary Kennedy was alive when the memoir was published, in an institution in Wisconsin, and had been there since 1949. The book mentions her. It does not dwell. A life recorded that carefully, by someone who understood so well what a record does, invites a particular question. Not what Rose Kennedy remembered, but what she decided was worth setting down, and when she first learned that lesson. She learned it early in Boston from her father. In the spring of 1906, Rose Fitzgerald finished Dorchester High School as the youngest graduate in her class. She was 15. The Boston papers noted it, because her father was the mayor, and because everything the mayor's family did was noted. There is a photograph of her from that period in the ceremonial pose of the era, hands folded, chin slightly lifted, a girl who had already been standing next to a politician on platforms for years and knew exactly where to put her eyes. She wanted Wellesley. She said so, at the time, and for the rest of her life. It was 7 miles from the house on Wells Avenue. It was the college that educated the daughters of Boston's professional families. And it was, by every measure available to a bright girl in 1906, the natural next step. She applied. She was accepted. John Francis Fitzgerald, Honey Fitz, the mayor, the ward organizer, the tenor who opened every rally with Sweet Adeline, did not let her go. The reasons he gave and the reasons offered afterward by everyone who wrote about the family are not identical. One account holds that he was advised by Cardinal William O'Connell, the Archbishop of Boston, that a Catholic girl in a secular women's college was a poor advertisement for a Catholic mayor. Another holds that he simply thought her too young, that 15 was 15 regardless of the diploma. A third, which Rose herself sometimes seemed to accept, is that it was a political calculation dressed as a moral one. The Irish Catholic wards that elected him watched what he did with his children, and Wellesley was Protestant Boston. What is not in dispute is what happened instead. She was enrolled at the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Boston, and then, with her sister Agnes, sent abroad. First to Blumenthal, a Sacred Heart convent school in Vals, in the Netherlands near the German border, and later to another Sacred Heart house in Manhattanville. At Blumenthal, the day began before 6. The girls rose in silence, went to Mass, ate in silence while a text was read aloud, and moved through the building at fixed hours under the supervision of nuns who did not think of themselves as teachers of subjects so much as builders of character. Letters home were read before they were sent. Friendships were monitored. Particular attachments between girls were discouraged as a matter of policy. There were retreats of several days during which the students did not speak at all. Rose was good at it. This is the part that is easy to skip past. She did not rebel, did not write miserable letters, did not fail to thrive. She was received into the Children of Mary. The Sacred Heart Order's honor sodality, an achievement she referred to with pride into her 90s and which mattered to her, by her own account, more than most secular distinctions she was later offered. The system that had been imposed on her against her wishes became something she believed in, but she never stopped saying she should have gone to Wellesley. She said it in the memoir, published when she was 84. She said it in interviews. She said it, according to more than one family account, in conversations across 60-odd years. and she attributed it plainly to her father's decision rather than to circumstance or her own age. Of everything that happened to her, and a great deal happened to her, this was the item she named as the enduring regret. A woman who declined to discuss the deaths of four of her children in any terms other than acceptance of God's will, spoke freely and repeatedly about a college she did not attend at 15. It is worth sitting with the shape of that without insisting on what it means. The Fitzgerald household she returned to between school terms was not a private house in any meaningful sense. Honey Fitz was mayor of Boston from 1906 to 1908 and again from 1910 to 1914, and his political method was physical presence. He attended, by one count that he encouraged, several parties a night, gave speeches at wakes and communion breakfasts and ship launchings, sang, shook hands, remembered names. His wife, Mary Josephine Hannon Fitzgerald, wanted no part of it. Josie Fitzgerald disliked public life with a consistency that her husband found inconvenient and eventually worked around. She stayed home, so he took his daughter. From roughly the age of 13, Rose functioned as her father's companion at public events, receiving lines, dedications, the mayor's box, the trip to Palm Beach, the delegations. In 1911, he took her to Europe on a trip with a party of businessmen. In 1908, at 17, she was presented at his side at a reception and the papers listed her name. She learned to stand for long periods, to be introduced to hundreds of people, to say the correct thing to a stranger who was watching for a mistake, and to leave nothing quotable behind. It was an apprenticeship, though nobody called it that, and it was the same apprenticeship she would later put her own children through in a different decade for a different set of offices. Two educations, then, running in parallel and in tension. The convent taught interiority, obedience, the management of the self, the value of a rule kept whether or not anyone was watching. Her father taught the opposite discipline, the management of appearance, the performance held steady in front of a crowd that would report on it. She was extremely good at both. There is very little in the record to suggest she experienced them as a contradiction. She also learned, in those years, what her father's public life cost the family in privacy. In 1913, Honey Fitz was involved in what became known as the Toodles affair, a matter involving a young cigarette girl named Elizabeth Ryan and a rival's willingness to make it public. That story belongs to the next chapter because of when it broke and what it interrupted. But the conditions for it were built here, in the years when the Fitzgeralds lived on a stage and Rose stood on it beside him. There was one further thing she wanted and did not get, and it is less often noted than Wellesley. She had been seeing Joseph Patrick Kennedy since they were teenagers. They had met as children at Old Orchard Beach in Maine, where both families summered, and had reconnected at Boston Latin functions and dances. Honey Fitz did not approve. The objection was not religion. The Kennedys were Irish Catholic too, and Joe's father, P.J. Kennedy, was a saloon owner turned ward boss and state legislator, a man of the same world. The objection appears to have been more particular and more personal. A rival's son, a rival's dynasty, and a young man Fitzgerald read accurately as ambitious in a way that would not accommodate a father-in-law. So he separated them. The convent terms abroad did part of the work. He arranged travel, encouraged other suitors, and made the courtship difficult for the better part of 7 years. Rose and Joe continued anyway, meeting where they could, and by 1912, the matter had settled into a slow siege in which the daughter did not defy the father and did not give up either. This is the pattern that shows up first here and recurs for the next 80 years. Rose Fitzgerald did not fight the men who made decisions about her life. She did not stage refusals. She complied, kept her own counsel, and waited. And quite often she got what she wanted eventually, the marriage, if not the college, with the compliance intact and the record clean. Where the strategy failed, as it failed at Wellesley, she kept the grievance permanently and mentioned it at intervals for the rest of her life, which is its own kind of accounting. There is a small document from this period worth noting. Rose kept diaries. She had begun as a girl, and she continued. And the entries from the convent years and the mayoral years are dutiful, observational, and remarkably unrevealing. Weather, mass, visitors, meals, who said what, at which function. They read like a record kept by someone who assumed it might be read. 60 years later, assembling times to remember, she went back to those diaries and used them as source material, and the memoir inherits their temperature exactly. She had learned, in other words, before she was 20, to keep the kind of record that could be handed to anyone. In the autumn of 1913, Honey Fitz began preparing to run again. He had lost the mayoralty briefly, regained it, and now faced the prospect of a challenge from James Michael Curley, a younger man from the same wards with fewer scruples and a better instinct for the jugular. Rose was 23. She had been out of the convent for 2 years, had done the season, had been to Europe, had been photographed as the mayor's daughter more times than could be counted. Joe Kennedy was working at the Columbia Trust Company in East Boston, moving toward the position that would make him, at 25, one of the youngest bank presidents in the country, and, not coincidentally, a man her father could no longer dismiss. What happened over the following 12 months would remove the last obstacle to that marriage. It would do so by way of a scandal that ended her father's career in its most public form, and it would demonstrate, to a daughter who was watching closely, precisely how a family could take a private matter, absorb it, decline to discuss it, and continue. The story that ended John Fitzgerald's mayoral career has never been fully established, and that is part of what makes it useful. In the autumn of 1913, a letter arrived at the Fitzgerald house on Wells Avenue. It was addressed to Josie Fitzgerald. Accounts of its contents differ in detail, but agree on substance. It alleged that her husband had been involved with a young woman who worked as a cigarette girl at a roadhouse in Middleton, north of Boston. Her name was Elizabeth Ryan. She was in her 20s. She was known in the papers and in the language of the city as Toodles. The letter was reported to have been signed or accompanied by a threat: withdraw from the coming election, or the matter goes public. The man behind it was almost certainly James Michael Curley, then a congressman, and preparing to take the mayoralty. Curley's method was direct. He announced a series of public lectures to be delivered in the coming weeks. The titles were printed. One was Great Lovers, From Cleopatra to Toodles. Another was on graft in municipal contracts. He never delivered them. He did not need to. In December 1913, Fitzgerald withdrew from the race, citing his health. He was 50. He would run for other offices for another 20 years. The Senate, the governorship, a congressional seat he won and lost on a recount. And he would never again hold the position that had defined him. What actually occurred between Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Ryan is not documented. There is no admission, no correspondence between them, no contemporaneous account from either party that survives in any reliable form. Ryan later married and lived an ordinary life. She gave no interviews of substance. Fitzgerald denied everything he was asked about for the rest of his life, in the manner of a man who understood that a denial repeated without variation eventually becomes the record. Curley told the story for decades, embellishing, and Curley was not a reliable narrator of anything. So the historical position is this: something existed that a rival believed was worth threatening with, and that a sitting mayor believed was worth surrendering his office to avoid. Whether it was an affair, an indiscretion, an exaggeration, or a fabrication that would nevertheless have been ruinous in Catholic Boston cannot now be determined. The consequence is documented. The cause is not. Rose was 23. She was living in the house. She had been her father's public companion for a decade, had stood beside him at hundreds of events, had been, in every practical sense, the family's second face. Whatever the household knew, she was inside the household while it knew it. She never discussed it. Not in the memoir, which covers her father's career at length and treats the 1913 withdrawal as a matter of health and shifting political fortunes. Not in her interviews. Not, so far as any record shows, with her children, who learned the Toodles story the way everyone else in Boston learned it, from the outside. Her mother's response is more visible because it was structural. Josie Fitzgerald had already withdrawn from public life. After 1913, the withdrawal became permanent and total. She did not appear. She did not accompany him. She remained married to him for another 40 years. He died in 1950, she in 1964, both past 90, and the marriage continued as an arrangement in which the wife was present, respected, unhumiliated in any visible way, and entirely absent from the part of his life that was conducted in front of other people. There is no evidence Rose was told to draw a conclusion from this. There is a great deal of evidence about what she did later. The engagement was announced in June 1914. The obstacle her father had maintained for 7 years had, by then, become untenable. Joseph Kennedy was 25 and president of the Columbia Trust Company in East Boston, a position he had reached by organizing a defense of the family bank against a takeover and installing himself at the top of it. The papers called him the youngest bank president in the country, which may or may not have been accurate and was certainly useful. He was no longer a ward boss's son. He was a man with a balance sheet. Fitzgerald consented. He does not appear to have consented warmly. They were married on October 7th, 1914, in the private chapel of Cardinal O'Connell, the same prelate who, by one account, had advised against Wellesley 8 years earlier. The wedding was small by the standards of a Fitzgerald event. About 75 people, breakfast afterward at the Wells Avenue house, no cathedral, no crowds. This was not modesty. It was a deliberate scaling down of a family that had been on the front page a year earlier for reasons nobody wished to recall. The mayor's daughter married quietly, 10 months after the mayor stopped being the mayor. They honeymooned at the Greenbrier in West Virginia, 2 weeks, and returned to a house Joe had bought at 83 Beale Street in Brookline. 7 rooms, a gray clapboard frontage, a piano in the front room, a modest street of similar houses. It cost him $6,500, most of it financed. Brookline was a step out of Irish Boston and into the professional suburbs, and it was chosen for that reason. Rose was pregnant almost immediately. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. was born in July 1915 at the Kennedy Summer Rental in Hull. John Fitzgerald Kennedy followed in May 1917. Rosemary in September 1918, Kathleen in February 1920. 4 children in 55 months. The house on Beale Street had 1 bathroom. What the marriage was, in those first years, can be partly reconstructed from where Joe Kennedy was. He was not often at Beale Street. In 1917, he took a position as assistant general manager of the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, which involved managing thousands of workers through the war, and which also, not incidentally, kept him out of the draft. He worked hours that his own accounts describe as consuming. In 1919, he moved to Hayden, Stone, and Company as manager of their Boston office and began the stock operations that would build the fortune. He traveled to New York constantly. He was building something, and he was building it away from the house. Rose was in the house, with the children, in a neighborhood that had not asked for her. Brookline in 1918 was not hostile in any dramatic way. It was simply closed. The Protestant families who ran Boston's banks and clubs and charitable boards had a social architecture that admitted Catholics as employees, tenants, and occasionally as guests, and admitted them into membership essentially never. Joe Kennedy would spend decades on this and would remain to the end a man who had bought his way past the barrier without dismantling it. He put it plainly to a reporter years later, asking how long a man had to live in a place before he was considered to be from it. He had been born in Boston, his children had been born in Boston, and he was still described as Irish. Rose experienced the same exclusion in a form that was more local and more constant, because she was the one at the school gate and the neighborhood function and the parish hall. She did not join the Protestant women's clubs because she could not. She built her life instead around the parish. the Sacred Heart Alumni Network, the daily Mass at St. Aidan's a few streets away, and a widening circle of Catholic charitable committees where the doors opened. She also began, in this period, to institute the practices that would later become famous: the index cards, the weight charts, the schedules, the notes. Some of that was simply a large family requiring administration. Some of it was a woman with a first rate mind and a convent education applying that mind to the only jurisdiction available to her. She had wanted Wellesley. She had 4 children under 5 and a husband in New York. The pattern that would define the next 50 years was set down in these years without any single moment marking it. Joe Kennedy's absences were, at first, entirely explicable by work. By the early 1920s, they had become something else as well. His reputation for pursuing women dates from this period and was, within his own circle, not concealed. Rose's response is not documented as a conversation, a confrontation, or a decision. What is documented is the shape her life took. Religious observance intensified, travel increased, the children's regimen tightened, and the marriage continued. In 1920, with 4 children and pregnant with a 5th, she left. She packed, took herself back to her father's house on Wells Avenue, and stayed. It is the only time in 70 years she is recorded as having withdrawn from the marriage. Honey Fitz let her remain about 3 weeks. Then he told her, in substance, that she had made her commitments to the marriage, to the children, to the church, and that she would honor them, and that the Fitzgeralds did not quit. She went back. The man delivering that instruction had, 7 years earlier, walked away from the office he loved, rather than let a private matter be spoken aloud. His wife had responded by removing herself permanently from his public life without ever once removing herself from the marriage. He was now telling his daughter to do a version of the same thing, and she did it, and she did not leave again. The card file sat in the front hall at Beale Street, and later moved with the family from house to house. It was a wooden box of the kind used in offices, filled with 3x5 index cards, 1 card per child. On each card, Rose entered the child's date of birth, baptism, and confirmation, height and weight at intervals, illnesses and their dates, dentist visits, vaccinations, the loss of teeth, shoe sizes, when a child had scarlet fever, whooping cough, measles, chickenpox, bronchitis. The card recorded when it began and how long it lasted. She kept it for years. It was practical. 9 children, 4 born before the eldest turned 6, and doctors who needed histories. And it was also more than practical. It gave her a set of numbers she could look at. There were more numbers. She weighed the children on a scale and posted the results. She kept a chart. She pinned notes to their clothing when they went out. She fixed the meal times so precisely that a child who came late did not eat, and she seated the family at 2 tables, older children with the adults, younger children separately, with promotion to the main table depending on age and on whether a child could hold up their end of a conversation. At the main table, she posted clippings from the newspaper on a board in the hall before dinner and expected the children to have read them. Then she asked about them. Questions about the news, about geography, about the countries she had traveled to, about what the family had seen on a trip to Plymouth or Concord. Jack, who read constantly and was often ill, did well at this. Joe Jr., who was 2 years older and larger and expected to be first at everything, defended his position. The competitions the family became known for were not confined to the sailing and the touch football, and they did not begin with Joe Sr. The discipline was hers as well. Joe Kennedy was not present enough to administer it, and by every account he found it distasteful when he was. Rose used a ruler, and later said so herself without apology, describing it as the ordinary practice of her time and of the household she had been raised in. She sent children to their rooms. She required, above all, a particular kind of composure. Complaints were discouraged, crying at the table was not permitted, and a child who fell and was hurt was expected to get up and continue. There is testimony from several of her children, offered in adulthood and mostly without bitterness, that they learned early not to bring her their unhappiness. The result was a household organized like an institution, and the institution it most resembled is the one she had been sent to at 15. Fixed hours, meals with a subject under discussion, silence at certain times, physical hardiness treated as a component of character, a regime of measurement and record. Rose had wanted Wellesley and had been given the convent of the Sacred Heart at Blumenthal, and when she came to build a system of her own, she built that one in Brookline, with her own children inside it. She also left. This is the part of the record that sits least comfortably beside the card file, and it is extensively documented, much of it by Rose herself. She traveled. She crossed the Atlantic 17 times, a figure she gave in her own accounting. She went to Europe for 6 weeks at a stretch. She went to Paris for clothes, to Ireland, to the Riviera, to South America once. She went to California when Joe was there. Closer to home, she went on religious retreats several times a year, 3 or 4 days at a Sacred Heart convent, silent, unreachable, and she treated these as non-negotiable. Her own memoir tells the story that has been retold most often. She was leaving on a trip, and Jack, then a small boy, said something to the effect that she was a great mother to go away and leave her children. She recorded it. She did not soften it, and she did not use it to argue that she had been wrong. Set the travel against the household, and the arrangement becomes visible. Rose managed her children through structure, and the structure was designed to run without her. The schedules, the notes, the nurses and governesses hired as the money increased, the 2 tables, the posted clippings. A system, once built, does not require the builder's continuous presence. She was gone, and the household did not fall apart because she had made it into something that could be operated by staff. Whether the travel was relief, self-preservation, or simply what a woman of her class did in the 1920s is not settled by anything in the record. She never described it as escape. She described it as necessary for her health, for her mind, for her marriage. Her husband, who was in New York, in Hollywood, on trains, was gone considerably more, and it was not remarked upon. The children kept coming. Eunice in 1921, Patricia in 1924, Robert in 1925, Jeanne in 1928, Edward, the last, in 1932, when Rose was 42. 9 children in 17 years. Between the 4th and the 5th, she had left her marriage for 3 weeks and been sent back. After that, she did not raise the question again, and there is no evidence in any surviving letter or account that she and Joe ever discussed the number of children or the possibility of limiting it. The church's position was clear to her, and she held it. Meanwhile, the money arrived, and it arrived at a rate that changed the family's location every few years. Beale Street was outgrown by 1920, and they moved to a larger house at the corner of Naples and Abbotsford Roads in Brookline, 12 rooms. By the mid-1920s, Joe was operating in Hollywood, running film companies, making the fortune that would survive 1929 because he had largely exited before it. In September 1927, he moved the entire family out of Boston, 9 people and staff, in a private railway car to a rented house in Riverdale, in the Bronx. The reason he gave, then and later, was that Boston was no place to raise Irish Catholic children. He meant the clubs, the schools, the invitations that would not come. He had made a great deal of money, and it had not moved the door. 2 years later, in 1929, they bought a house on 6 acres in Bronxville, in Westchester, for a reported $250,000. In 1928, he bought the house at Hyannis Port on Cape Cod that the family had been renting since 1926, the one that became the compound. In 1933, he bought the villa in Palm Beach, on North Ocean Boulevard, designed by Addison Misner, with the ocean on one side and a great deal of privacy on all the others. He established trust funds for the children, the first in 1926, another in 1936, arranged so that each child would have an independent income for life and would never be obliged to earn one. Rose ran all of these houses. She moved the household between them on a seasonal schedule: Bronxville, Hyannisport in summer, Palm Beach in winter, with the children, the nurses, the schooling arrangements, the church attendance, and the luggage. She was, by any reasonable description, the chief executive of a considerable operation, and she performed the role with the precision that everyone who observed her noted. What she did not have was Boston. The move to New York was Joe's answer to exclusion. It was not hers. She had grown up as the mayor's daughter in a city where her family name opened every Irish door and her religion closed every other one, and she had built her social existence out of what was available: the parish, the Sacred Heart alumni, the Catholic charity boards, the Ace of Clubs she had founded herself in 1911 for young Catholic women who had traveled abroad. In Bronxville, she was a wealthy Catholic newcomer in a Protestant suburb with no such infrastructure. She attended daily Mass. She went to Europe. She kept the cards. There is one further practice that belongs to this period, and it is the one that turns out to matter most. She wrote things down. Not only on the index cards, she kept diaries, as she had since girlhood, and she kept letters. She kept her own carbons. She began, at some point in the 1920s or 1930s, to organize a family correspondence, round-robin letters to the children at their various schools, reporting on the others, on the household, on where their father was, and instructing them to write back. Some of these letters survive. They are brisk, informative, full of scheduling and small corrections of spelling and grammar, and almost entirely free of intimacy. She was assembling an archive of the family before there was any public reason to have one. Later, when there was every reason, the archive existed, in her handwriting, saying what she had chosen to say. Somewhere in that file was a card for Rosemary, born in September 1918 in the house on Beale Street during the influenza epidemic, with a doctor who was late and a nurse who had been told to wait. The card recorded her weight and her illnesses and her teeth like all the others. It did not have a column for the thing that was already becoming apparent. In the autumn of 1927, Joseph Kennedy was running film companies in Hollywood, and Gloria Swanson was the most highly paid actress in the world. She earned around $20,000 a week, wore the clothes that the industry copied, had been married 3 times by the age of 28, and had recently become an independent producer, which meant that her financial affairs were a catastrophe. She needed a businessman. He offered to reorganize her company. By the following year, he was producing her pictures, restructuring her debts, taking control of her contracts, and the relationship was no longer confined to the accounts. The affair lasted roughly 3 years. It was not conducted discreetly. In Hollywood, it was assumed. In New York, it was known. Joe Kennedy brought Gloria Swanson to Palm Beach, sailed with her on the family's boat, put her on the Kennedy plane, and, this is the part that has never been satisfactorily explained by anyone, brought her into the presence of his wife. They met more than once. There is a photograph from 1929 of the 2 women together at a Kennedy house. Swanson later wrote, in her 1980 memoir, Swanson on Swanson, about a transatlantic crossing in 1929 in which she traveled with both Kennedys, and about the disorienting experience of being received by Rose as a guest, treated with courtesy, and included in family arrangements. Her account is that of a woman who could not tell what she was looking at. She wondered whether Rose knew and was pretending, or genuinely did not know, or knew and had decided that the situation was to be managed rather than acknowledged. She could not settle it, and she said so. Swanson's memoir is the primary source for a great deal of this, and it should be read as what it is: an account written 50 years later by a participant with her own reputation to arrange, describing a man she came to believe had defrauded her. Her charge on the financial side, that Kennedy had charged her own money against her own productions, including gifts he appeared to have given her, has been substantially supported by other examinations of the records. Her reading of Rose is a guess by an observer. The observer's guess is nevertheless the best evidence available because Rose left nothing. She never referred to Gloria Swanson in any hostile terms. In Times to Remember, Swanson appears as a business associate of her husband's and a professional acquaintance, described with the same evenness applied to everything else. She never, in any surviving letter, diary entry, interview, or reported conversation, said that her husband was unfaithful to her. Her children were less protected. Several of them, in adulthood, described the household's understanding of their father as an open one. The stories accumulated, the actresses, the secretaries, the young women brought to Hyannis Port and to Palm Beach in the decades that followed, the well-known guests who noticed the pattern and mentioned it later. This continued into the 1950s. It was not a secret from anyone in the family, except in the sense that it was never spoken about in Rose's hearing, and she never introduced the subject herself. What she did instead is documented in the shape of her calendar. The Palm Beach house had been bought in 1933. The Misner Villa on North Ocean Boulevard, stucco, ocean frontage, high walls. It became the winter residence. Hyannis Port was the summer. Bronxville, and later New York, was the base. Rose moved between them with the household, and within each of them she constructed a life that ran alongside her husband's without intersecting it. She went to Mass every morning, wherever she was, and she went alone. In Palm Beach, she walked to St. Edward's. She had a small room fitted out for herself and did not invite company into it. She swam and walked at fixed hours. She went on retreats several times a year and could not be reached. She traveled to Europe, and the travel increased rather than diminished as the children grew. She had her clothes made in Paris and kept meticulous records of what she had bought and worn, cataloging outfits by occasion so that she would not repeat one in front of the same audience. Her marriage, by the mid-1930s, had become a structure with two independent operations under one name. He had New York, Hollywood, Washington, and whatever else he had. She had the houses, the children, the church, and the record. They met at meals, at family gatherings, at public events, and they presented, on every such occasion, the united appearance of the family they had built. They also corresponded warmly for 50 years. This is the fact that resists a simple reading of the arrangement. The surviving letters between Joe and Rose Kennedy are affectionate, funny, practical, and full of mutual regard. He called her a remarkable woman in letters to third parties and appears to have meant it. He deferred to her absolutely on religion and on the daughters. She defended him in public without qualification, through the isolationism, through the ambassadorship's collapse, through everything. Whatever they had agreed on it, and the affection in the correspondence does not read as performance. There is no document in which the terms were set. There is only the fact that the terms held for half a century, and that the woman who accepted them had watched her mother accept something similar in 1913 and had been personally instructed by her father in 1920 that leaving was not available to her. One further element belongs to this period, and it concerns money. Joseph Kennedy controlled the family's finances with total authority and considerable secrecy. He established the trusts, he made the investments, he set the allowances. His children received income from trusts he had structured. None of them, including the sons who went into politics, ever needed to earn a living, and none of them had any real say in how the money was managed. Rose received an allowance. She was the wife of one of the richest men in America, and she operated on a budget he set, and she was known, into her 90s, for a frugality that visitors found startling. Reusing paper, turning off lights, wearing clothes for decades, complaining about waste in houses where the staff numbered in the dozens. She managed the households, but she did not control the money that ran them. The financial dependence is the piece that gives the arrangement its weight. In 1920, when she went back to her father's house, she had 4 children and no independent income, and a church that did not recognize divorce. By 1930, she had 8 children and no independent income, and a husband whose fortune was among the largest in the country, held entirely in his name and in trusts he had drafted. The options had not increased. They had narrowed, and they had narrowed in proportion to the wealth. In the summer of 1929, Gloria Swanson came to Hyannis Port. There is a photograph of the visit. Rose is in it. So are several of the children, who were old enough to remember and who did. Rosemary was 10 that year. She had been at day school and had not kept up. She had been tutored at home and had not kept up. Her handwriting was large and effortful. Her letters, which survive, are affectionate and simple, written by a girl several years behind where she should have been. Her parents had begun consulting specialists, quietly, and receiving assessments that Joe Kennedy did not accept and that Rose recorded in her own hand without recording her feelings about them. The family was about to enter its most visible decade. Rosemary would be presented at the court of St. James's alongside her sister, photographed in a white gown with ostrich feathers in her hair, and would look, in every photograph taken that day, exactly like the daughter of an ambassador. Joseph Kennedy was appointed United States ambassador to the court of St. James's in December 1937 and presented his credentials in March 1938. It was, on the face of it, an extraordinary appointment. An Irish Catholic from Boston, a Wall Street operator with a Hollywood career behind him, sent to represent the United States at the most socially exacting post in the diplomatic service. Roosevelt had reasons of his own. The Kennedys understood what it meant. Rose arrived at the residence in Prince's Gate, 36 rooms, a staff of over 20, a lift, a ballroom, in March 1938 with the younger children. She was 47. She began keeping a detailed diary immediately, and she kept it throughout, and it is the fullest and least guarded record she ever produced about her own life. She recorded the dinners, the seating, the names, the clothes, the protocol, the small errors, and how they were corrected. She wrote about being addressed as Her Excellency and about how strange it was to hear. She had spent her adult life in a country where Boston's clubs would not admit her husband. She was now, in the space of a few weeks, seated at Windsor Castle. The invitation came for a weekend in April. The Kennedys stayed at Windsor as guests of the King and Queen, dined, slept in the castle, attended chapel. Rose recorded it in detail: the size of the rooms, the fire in the grate, the conversation with Queen Elizabeth about children, the bagpipes. Later, she went to Rome for the coronation of Pius XIII in March 1939, where the Kennedys were seated in a position of honor as the official American delegation, and where the new pope, whom they had met in 1936 when he was Cardinal Pacelli and had entertained at their Bronxville house, gave the family a private audience and administered First Communion to 7-year-old Teddy. For a Catholic woman of her generation and her background, the sequence of those months is difficult to overstate. She had been shut out of Protestant Boston and had built her entire social world inside the church. Now the church's supreme office and the British Crown had received her in the same 12 months, and the photographs went home to Boston. Then there were the daughters. Kathleen was 18 and Rosemary was 19, and both were to be presented at court in May 1938. Presentation at that period required a sponsor, a strict protocol, and clothes: white gowns, trains, the 3 ostrich feathers in the hair, the 2 curtsies. Rose supervised the preparation. The dresses came from Paris, Molyneux in the accounts of the time, and the girls practiced the curtsy for weeks. Rosemary's presentation was the risk, and everyone in the family knew it. She was, by 1938, unmistakably behind. She had been through a long succession of schools: day schools, boarding convents, a special arrangement at a school in Rhode Island, tutors, and had made limited progress in any of them. Her letters home are simple and warm and full of a straightforward desire to please. She had beauty, which the family remarked on constantly, and a placid manner, and she could hold a conversation for a short time if the conversation was not demanding. The presentation required her to walk a fixed route in an unfamiliar room in front of the monarch and perform a curtsy without falling. She stumbled slightly and recovered, and it passed without notice. The photographs from that day show two dark-haired sisters in white, indistinguishable in poise from any other girl in the room. That London year is the one Rose returned to for the rest of her life. She said, in later interviews and in the memoir, that it was the happiest period of her life, and the diary supports it. Rosemary attended a Montessori training course run by nuns at Belmont House in Hertfordshire, and it suited her better than anything had before. She wrote home about teaching small children, and her letters from that period are the most confident she ever produced. Kathleen Kick entered London society and was an immediate success in a way none of the family had anticipated, taken up by a set of aristocratic young people who found her funny and unimpressed. Jack traveled Europe and gathered the material that became his Harvard thesis and then Why England Slept. Joe Jr. worked at the embassy. The whole family was briefly exactly where Joe and Rose had spent 25 years trying to place it. It ended in about 18 months, and it ended because of the ambassador. Joseph Kennedy did not believe Britain could win a war against Germany. He said so in dispatches to Washington, in private conversations that were reported, and eventually in public. He supported appeasement past the point where it was British government policy. He was reported to have made remarks about Jews that circulated in London and were not denied. After war was declared in September 1939, he moved his office out of the city and was widely understood to be waiting for a British defeat, and the Roosevelt administration began to route its important business around him. In November 1940, back in the United States, he gave an interview to the Boston Globe in which he said democracy was finished in England and might be finished in America too. The furor was immediate. He resigned that month. Rose defended him. She defended him in 1938, in 1940, and in every year afterward, without qualification and without any recorded moment of private doubt. Her position was that her husband had been trying to keep his sons out of a war, that he had been right about the cost, and that he had been destroyed for saying what others thought. She held that position for 50 years. The family came home. The children had been sent back at intervals through 1939 and 1940 as the situation deteriorated. Rose returned in 1940. She was 50, she had been an ambassador's wife for 2.5 years, and she was now the wife of a man whose public career was over and whose name in the American press was attached to defeatism. Rosemary came back too, and the return was worse for her than for anyone. England had given her the one arrangement that worked: the Montessori course, the routine, the nuns, the small children, a job she could do. In the United States, there was nothing equivalent. She was placed at a convent in Washington, then elsewhere, and the placements did not hold. She was now 22 and no longer a girl who could be described as a slow learner. She had begun to have episodes. Accounts from the family and from those who worked with her describe agitation, rages, physical outbursts, and at least some nights when she left the convent where she was living and was found later wandering. The family's language for it at the time was that she was becoming difficult. What they meant, and what the record makes reasonably clear, is that a young woman with an intellectual disability was entering her 20s in a household organized entirely around achievement and appearance, and that the arrangements which had contained her as a child were failing. There was also, in 1941, the beginning of a political future. Joe Jr. and Jack were being positioned. The family's public standing had been damaged by the ambassadorship and would have to be rebuilt. A daughter who might disappear at night in Washington, who might be found in a situation that could not be explained, was a risk in a way she had not been at 15. And the men in the family thought in those terms as a matter of habit. Rose's diary and correspondence from this period record the doctors, the schools, the assessments, the practical difficulties, the arrangements attempted and abandoned. They record her attention. They do not record despair. In the autumn of 1941, while Rose was away, Joseph Kennedy took his daughter to a hospital in Washington, D.C. The operation was performed in November 1941 at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. Rosemary Kennedy was 23 years old. The procedure was a prefrontal lobotomy, and the surgeons were Walter Freeman and James Watts. Freeman was a neurologist, not a surgeon. Watts performed the cutting. They had introduced the operation to the United States in 1936, adapting a technique developed in Portugal by Egas Moniz, and by 1941, they had performed it perhaps 80 times. They advertised it in medical journals and in the popular press as a treatment for agitation, for depression, for what was then called involutional melancholia, and for behavior that families could not manage. It was legal, it was written up favorably in the New York Times and the Saturday Evening Post, and Moniz would receive the Nobel Prize for the underlying work in 1949. It was also, by 1941, opposed by a substantial part of the neurological profession, and the opposition was on the record. The results were unpredictable. Nobody knew what the operation actually did. Watts later described what happened in the theater in an account given to the journalist Ronald Kessler. Rosemary was conscious, under local anesthetic. They opened the skull and made the cuts while she was asked to talk, to recite, to count backward, to sing. They cut until the responses stopped making sense. Then they stopped. She never recovered. She was left unable to speak more than a few words, unable to walk properly at first, incontinent, and permanently incapable of independent life. Whatever she had been able to do before, the letters, the Montessori course, the conversations at dinner, the presentation at court, she could no longer do. She was 23, and she would live another 64 years. The central question about Rose Kennedy's life sits here, and it cannot be answered with certainty. What is documented? Joseph Kennedy arranged the operation. He consulted the doctors, he made the decision, he took his daughter to the hospital. Rose was not present. In her own account, given in the memoir published 33 years later, and in remarks to family members, she learned about the operation and its consequences after the fact. Several accounts, including those drawing on family interviews, go further and hold that Joe did not tell her he was proceeding. Others hold that she knew an operation was under discussion, that she had made her own inquiries. She had, by her own account, spoken to doctors about the procedure and been told by at least one that it was not advisable and that she did not know the date or the extent. Rose herself said she had been told by a doctor that the surgery could leave a patient permanently damaged and that she had reported this. What she did not say, ever, in any interview or letter or page of the memoir, is that she opposed it, that she tried to stop it, or that she was angry about it afterward. The one thing she was unambiguous about was that she did not consent to it and was not consulted at the time. There is no letter of protest. There is no recorded confrontation with her husband. There is no diary entry from November or December 1941 that addresses what had been done. She had written about seating plans at Windsor in considerable detail. About this, she wrote nothing that survives. What happened next is more measurable because it involves years. Rosemary was moved first to a private psychiatric institution in New York Craig House at Beacon-on-the-Hudson, where she stayed until 1949. In 1949, she was transferred to St. Coletta's, a Catholic institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin, run by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi. Joe Kennedy paid for a private house to be built on the grounds, a cottage where she lived with 2 nuns and a car and a driver. He funded it. He arranged everything about it. He did not visit her. According to the accounts of the family and the sisters at St. Coletta's, Joseph Kennedy never saw his daughter again after the operation. He died in 1969. That is 28 years. Rose did not visit either, not for roughly 20 years. The dating varies slightly across sources, but the substance is consistent. After Rosemary was moved to Wisconsin in 1949, Rose did not travel to see her until sometime after Joe's stroke in December 1961, and by several accounts, not until nearer to the mid-1960s. Eunice, who became the family member most closely involved with Rosemary and who founded the Special Olympics in 1968 with her sister explicitly in mind, brought her back into the family's life. Rose then visited and continued to visit and had Rosemary brought to Hyannis Port and Palm Beach in later years, and the two women were photographed together in old age. But the gap is there, and it is 2 decades long, and it began while Rosemary was in her 30s and Rose was in her 50s and traveling to Europe every year. Any explanation offered for this is inference. Several are available, and they are not mutually exclusive. Joe Kennedy controlled the arrangement and did not want visits, and Rose complied with her husband on family decisions as she had complied on everything else for 30 years. The medical advice of the period, which was explicit and widely given, was that families of the institutionalized should stay away, that visits disturbed the patient and prolonged the family's difficulty, and that a clean separation was kindest to everyone. Rose repeated a version of this in later years. There is also the possibility that she could not do it, that seeing what had been done to her daughter was beyond what she had built herself to withstand, and that the machinery of composure she had assembled since girlhood had no setting for it. And there is the fact, which does not require inference, that the family told the public a different story for 20 years. Rosemary was described as shy, as retiring, as a teacher working with children with disabilities in the Midwest, as having chosen a quiet religious life. That story was maintained through Jack's congressional campaigns, through the 1952 Senate race, through the 1960 presidential campaign. It was corrected publicly only in 1961 and after, and even then partially, with the disability acknowledged and the operation not. Rose participated in the maintenance of that account. She gave interviews during those years in which she was asked about her children, and she answered about all 9. The last piece of evidence is the memoir. Times to Remember was published in 1974, when Rosemary was 56 and living in Wisconsin, and Rose was 84. The book runs to more than 500 pages. Rosemary appears in it. Her birth, her difficulties, her schooling, the presentation at court, and a passage about the decision to place her, written with restraint, and with the operation described in terms that do not convey what was done. The book was Rose's. She had the diaries, the letters, the cards. She had spent 60 years keeping a record precisely so that a record would exist. When she came to write the account that would stand, she wrote the version the family had already agreed on. Whether that was a mother's protection of a daughter's dignity, or a wife's loyalty to a husband 12 years dead, or the last operation of a habit learned in 1913 from a man who understood that a private matter should never be spoken aloud. The pages do not say. There was one further consequence, and it arrived 7 years after the operation, in a different form and in another country. Kathleen Kennedy was the 4th child and the 2nd daughter, and by common agreement inside and outside the family, she was the one everybody liked. She was funny in a dry, unimpressed way. She was not beautiful in the manner of her sisters, and it did not seem to cost her anything. She had gone to London at 18, been taken up by a set of aristocratic young people who had seen a great many American heiresses and found this one different, and had made herself, within a season, genuinely popular in a society that did not hand out popularity. Among that set was William Cavendish, Marquis of Hartington, called Billy. He was the eldest son of the 10th Duke of Devonshire. The Devonshires held Chatsworth, Lismore, Hardwicke, and a title that ran back to the 16th century. They were also, and this was not incidental, one of the most prominent Protestant families in Britain, with a specifically anti-Catholic history. The Cavendishes had been on the Protestant side of every English religious settlement since the Reformation, and the family's Irish holdings gave the point a sharper edge. Kik and Billy had known each other since 1938. The war separated them. She came home in 1939 and returned to London in 1943 with the Red Cross, working at a servicemen's club in Knightsbridge. By early 1944, they intended to marry. The obstacle was the church, and it was not a formality. A Catholic marrying a Protestant required a dispensation, and the dispensation required an undertaking that the children would be raised Catholic. Billy Hartington could not give it. The heir to the Dukedom of Devonshire could not agree to raise the next duke as a Catholic. His father would not permit it, and the family's position made it close to unthinkable. Efforts were made on both sides for months. Approaches to churchmen, proposals about alternating the religion of sons and daughters, appeals to Rome. None of it produced an answer in time. Kick wrote home. The letters and cables from the spring of 1944 are among the most direct documents the family produced. She explained the situation, she asked for help, and she asked her mother, in particular, to intervene with the church, which Rose had the connections to attempt. Rose's response was total. She wrote back opposing the marriage in the strongest terms available to her. She told her daughter that marrying outside the church meant living in a state of sin and being cut off from the sacraments. She invoked the effect on the family, on the other children, on the family's standing among Catholics. According to accounts within the family, she raised the possibility of disinheritance and made clear that the marriage would not be recognized. She enlisted a priest, father, later archbishop, to write to Kick as well, and asked others to write. She did not soften the position at any point and did not offer a route by which the marriage might be accepted afterward. Joe Kennedy's position was different. He was in Hyannis Port, and he cabled his daughter with a message of support, the substance of which was that she should follow her own judgment and that he was with her, whatever she decided. The Devonshire connection did not offend him. It was, by the standards he had spent his life applying, an extraordinary result. The marriage took place on May 6, 1944, at the Chelsea Register Office in London. A register office, because no church of either denomination would perform it. The bride wore a borrowed dress. The Duke and Duchess of Devonshire attended. Of the Kennedys, one person was present, Joe Jr., who was flying with the Navy in England and who came in defiance of what his mother had asked, and who cabled home afterward in his sister's defense. Rose was in a hospital. She entered New England Baptist Hospital in Boston around the time of the wedding and remained there for a period afterward. The family said she was unwell. What is documented is that she was not available to the press, not available to comment, and not visible during the days in which the newspapers carried the story of a Kennedy daughter marrying a Protestant peer without the blessing of the church. Whether the illness was genuine, strategic, or both cannot be established from anything in the record. She had, in 1920, gone to her father's house and stayed 3 weeks. She was 53 now, and the mechanisms had become more sophisticated. She also worked to keep the family from attending, and she succeeded with everyone but Joe Jr. Then time compressed. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. was killed over Suffolk. He had volunteered for a secret operation involving an aircraft packed with explosives that was to be flown toward a target and abandoned in midair after the crew armed the payload. The plane exploded prematurely. Nothing was recovered. He was 29, the eldest, the one the whole apparatus had been built around. The news reached Hyannis Port on a Sunday. The account that survives is that the family had come back from Mass, that 2 priests arrived at the house, and that Joe Kennedy took them into the front room and heard it and then came out and told everyone. Rose's response, as recorded by more than one person present, was to insist that the children should go on with the day, that they should go sailing as planned. 3 weeks later, on September 10th, Billy Hartington was killed in Belgium, shot by a sniper while leading his men. He and Kick had been married 4 months and had spent perhaps 5 weeks together. Kick came home to a family that had just lost its eldest son as a widow whose marriage her mother had opposed and refused to recognize. She stayed a short time and went back to England, where the Devonshires, who had every doctrinal reason to be cold to her and were not, treated her as their son's widow and kept her. She lived in London. She was 24. Rose's position did not move. There is no evidence that the widowhood altered her view of the marriage. Kik had married outside the church, and the marriage had not been regularized, and death did not undo that. By 1947, Kik had formed a relationship with Peter Fitzwilliam, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam. He was Protestant, he was married, and he was seeking a divorce. This was, by the terms Rose held, incomparably worse than Billy Hardington had been. Kik intended to marry him and understood exactly what it would cost. In May 1948, she arranged to meet her father in Paris, hoping to gain his agreement. She and Fitzwilliam flew south ahead of the meeting in a chartered plane into weather that the pilots had been advised against. The aircraft went down in the Ardèche in southern France on May 13, 1948. Everyone aboard was killed. Kathleen Kennedy was 28. Joe Kennedy was in Paris. He went to the crash site and identified his daughter. He was the only member of the family to do so, and he was the only member of the family at the funeral. She was buried at Edensor, in Derbyshire, on the Devonshire estate, in the churchyard of the family she had married into. The Duchess of Devonshire made the arrangements. The Kennedys did not attend. Rose did not go. She was 57 and in reasonable health, and the war was over, and she had crossed the Atlantic 17 times in her life for other reasons. Her second daughter was buried in an English country churchyard by her husband's Protestant family, and her mother was not there. The inscription on the stone was chosen by the Duchess. It reads that joy is given to those who knew her, and sorrow to those who lost her. Rose visited the grave in later years. She had it photographed. The photograph went into the family's records with everything else. The tea parties began in Massachusetts, and they were Rose's idea. In 1946, Jack Kennedy ran for Congress in the 11th District, East Boston, Charlestown, Cambridge, the wards his grandfather had worked. He was 29, thin to the point of alarm, still carrying the back injury and the wartime illness, and awkward at the retail politics that Honey Fitz had performed like a vaudeville turn. He did not have his brother's ease. Joe Jr. had been dead 2 years, and the family's political ambition had been transferred to a son who had not been raised for it. Rose was 56. She went to work. The formula was simple, and it was tuned precisely to the electorate. Formal receptions, invitations printed and mailed, a receiving line, white gloves, tea and small sandwiches, and the candidate's mother and sisters standing beside him. The women who came were Irish and Italian Catholic women from three-decker neighborhoods who had never in their lives been invited to anything with a printed invitation, and they came in their good coats. Rose received them. She spoke about raising 9 children, about the household, about her father, the mayor. Many of the older women remembered him, and about Jack, and she did it in the register she had learned standing beside Honey Fitz at 14. The receptions ran through every Kennedy campaign for the next 20 years. By 1952, when Jack took on Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. for the Senate, the operation had scaled up. Dozens of teas, tens of thousands of women, a mailing list, a system. The Lodge campaign never found an answer to it. Lodge's grandfather had beaten Honey Fitz for the same Senate seat in 1916, and the symmetry was not lost on anyone in Boston. Rose was, in these years, an unusually effective political performer, and this is the part of her life she enjoyed without visible complication. She could work a room of 800 women. She could speak in French to a French-Canadian audience and in Italian to an Italian one, having prepared. She campaigned in West Virginia in 1960, in Wisconsin, in New York. She gave interviews. She was photographed constantly and knew exactly how to be photographed. She had spent 40 years building an image of a family, and she was now deploying it in front of an electorate, and it worked. There was a second thing she was doing at the same time, and it is less often described as campaigning. She was managing the record. In interviews across the 1950s, she gave the accounts of her children that she had settled on. The discipline, the dinner table discussions, the faith, the competitiveness, the 9 children raised the same way. It was true, and it was incomplete in specific places. Rosemary was, in this period, described as living quietly in the Midwest and working with children. Kick was described as a daughter lost in a plane crash. The marriage to Billy Hardington and the mother's opposition to it were not part of the account offered to Catholic voters in Massachusetts. The father's isolationism was defended. The father's other conduct did not come up. Joseph Kennedy had by this time made himself invisible on purpose. His name was a liability after 1940, and he understood it better than anyone. He financed, organized, telephoned, hired, and pressured entirely off the platform. In 1960, he was kept out of sight almost completely. The campaign's private line was that the father was to be neither seen nor heard. So the family's public face in the years the presidency was won was Rose's. On January 20th, 1961, she sat in the stands at the Capitol in the cold and watched her son take the oath of office. She was 70. She had been the daughter of a mayor who was forced out of office by a threat, the wife of an ambassador who was forced out of his post by his own opinions, and she was now the mother of a president. The photographs from that day show her in a fur hat, upright, entirely composed. Her father had been dead 11 years. Her husband was beside her. 11 months later, on December 19th, 1961, Joseph Kennedy played golf in Palm Beach, felt unwell, and returned to the house. He had a stroke. It was massive. It left him paralyzed on the right side, and more consequentially, without speech. He lived another 7 years and 8 months in that condition. He could produce sounds. He could indicate yes and no, sometimes unreliably. He wept easily and became furious easily, and the fury had no outlet in words. He was moved by wheelchair and by lift between Hyannisport and Palm Beach on the old seasonal schedule, attended by nurses and by a therapist, and he attended family occasions and was photographed at them, and he understood, by every account, everything that was said around him. The man who had controlled the family's money, its decisions, its arrangements, and its silences for 47 years, could no longer speak. Rose was 71. She did not take over the fortune. That had passed to trustees, and to the family office, and to Ted, and to the family's lawyers. What passed to her was the household and the position. The accounts of those years from within the family are consistent on the shape of it and vary on the tone. She ran the houses. She set the schedules. She decided who came and when, what was served, when meals happened, what the grandchildren did. She continued to swim daily and to attend Mass daily and to travel to Paris for clothes. She was, by several descriptions from those who visited Hyannisport in the 1960s, exacting in a way that had previously been buffered by her husband's larger presence and now was not. She also spent time with him. She read to him. She sat with him. She was photographed pushing his wheelchair. What passed between them in those rooms is not recorded by either of them, and neither of them could have recorded it in the same way. She would not, and he no longer could. There is one documented episode from this period that is difficult to place and impossible to ignore. In the years after the stroke, Rose began to visit Rosemary in Wisconsin. Eunice had been pressing for it. Rosemary was brought east on visits to Hyannisport and to Palm Beach, and photographs from the later 1960s and afterward show her with her mother and her sisters. She could not really speak. She could walk with difficulty, and she needed constant attendance. The father who had authorized the operation could not be told, or could be told, and could not answer. So the two silences arrived in the same house at the same time, the daughter who had been made unable to speak in 1941, and the husband who had made her that way and had now lost the same faculty. And the woman between them was the only person in the family who had known the whole of it from the beginning and had never once said it out loud. She was 72 years old. Her son was president of the United States. In 11 months, he would be dead in Dallas, and she would be photographed the following morning walking to Mass. The news from Dallas reached Hyannisport on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. Rose was in the house. Ted and Eunice flew up from Washington to be there. The immediate problem was the man upstairs. The decision was made not to tell Joe. He had had the stroke 2 years earlier. The doctors were consulted, and the family agreed he could not withstand it. So the television in his room was disabled. The story that has come down is that a wire was pulled and the set was reported as broken, and for a day and a night, the household moved around him carrying something he was not permitted to know. The telephones rang. The cars came. Cape Cod filled with press. He was told the following day by Ted. Rose was in the room. He could not speak. He indicated that he understood. What she did on the morning of November 23rd was go to Mass, as she had every morning for 50 years, and she was photographed doing it. She was 73, in a dark coat and a headscarf, walking to St. Francis Xavier in Hyannis with her son's death, less than a day old, and cameras positioned along the route. That photograph, and the ones from the funeral 2 days later, established the image that attached to her for the rest of her life. The composure was read by a country that badly needed something to read as faith. It was reported as saintly. She received tens of thousands of letters from strangers. Her own explanation, given repeatedly across the next 20 years, never varied. She believed that God did not send more than a person could bear, that grief displayed was grief indulged, and that her obligation was to keep going and to keep the rest of the family going. She said she had been raised not to weep in public. She said that a mother who collapsed would take the others with her. There is no reason to doubt she meant it. There is also the fact, available to anyone who set the years side by side, that she had said versions of the same thing in 1944 when Joe Jr. was killed and the children were sent sailing, and in 1948 when Kik was buried in Derbyshire without her, and that the practice long predated the presidency. What the country took for a response to catastrophe was a habit 60 years old, formed in a convent and refined in a marriage, and 1963 was simply the first time the whole country watched it operate. Behind the composure, there is very little evidence of anything. She wrote no letter of grief that has surfaced. Her diaries from the period are sparse. She told an interviewer, years afterward, that she had walked on the beach at Hyannis Port and cried where no one could see, and that is close to the only such statement she ever made about any of it. Then it kept coming. Joe died in November 1969 at Hyannis Port, aged 81, after 8 years without speech. Rose was 79. The marriage had lasted 55 years. Before that, in June 1968, Robert was shot in Los Angeles. She was 78. She flew to New York for the funeral at St. Patrick's and stood through it, and afterward, she was photographed at Arlington. Her public statement was that she had faith, that she would go on. In between, in July 1969, there was Chappaquiddick, a young woman dead in a car off a bridge on Martha's Vineyard, her last surviving son giving an account that satisfied almost nobody, and a scandal that ran for a decade. Rose defended him without reservation and continued to do so. Her position on family matters had never depended on the facts of the matter. She was, by 1970, 80 years old and had outlived 4 of her 9 children. Rosemary was in Wisconsin. Joe Sr. was dead. She had 30 grandchildren, a family compound, an income arranged by trustees, and something no one else alive possessed, the complete record. She had the diaries, kept since girlhood. She had the letters, hers, her husband's, the children's, the round robins, the carbons. She had the cards. She had 60 years of clippings and photographs and notes. She had been assembling this since Brookline, before there was any conceivable public reason to. Between 1969 and 1974, she used it. Times to Remember was published in 1974, when she was 84. It was written with the assistance of Robert Coughlin, and it was substantially built from her own materials. The diaries and letters are quoted throughout. It sold enormously. She donated the proceeds to charity and to the Kennedy Library, which she had also been working to establish, and to which she gave her papers. The book is warm, specific, and controlled. It is also, in its handling of the things this documentary has traced, a series of decisions. Wellesley is there, named as her regret, 68 years later. Her father's withdrawal from the 1913 race is health and politics. Toodles does not appear. Her marriage is affectionate and long. Her husband's conduct with other women does not appear. Gloria Swanson is a business associate. Rosemary's difficulties are described with care, and the operation is described in terms that do not convey what was done or who authorized it. Kathleen's marriage is present, and Rose's opposition is present, and the register office and the hospital stay and the campaign to keep the family away are handled in a paragraph that does not linger. Kathleen's death is grief. Joe Jr.'s death is grief. Dallas is faith. Nothing in it is a lie in any way that could be identified and disputed. It is a book made almost entirely of omissions, and the omissions are consistent with one another, which is how you can tell they were chosen. She did more than the book. She sat for interviews and documentaries through the 1970s. She corresponded with historians and with the library. She wrote to authors who were preparing books about the family, and where she disagreed with them, she said so, and where she could influence access, she did. Her papers went to the Kennedy Library on her own terms. Portions of the family's material, including material bearing on Rosemary and on her husband's affairs, remained restricted for decades. She had been raised by a man who understood that a matter not spoken of eventually ceases to have happened. She had married a man who bought and arranged and financed the version of events he wanted circulating. She had spent her life inside two operations of that kind, and in her 80s, she ran the third one herself, and it was the most successful of the three, because it was the one that lasted. By 1980, the popular understanding of Rose Kennedy was settled. The matriarch, the woman of faith, the mother who bore what could not be borne, the last authority on what the family had been. Interviewers asked her about strength. She answered about God. She was 90 years old, sitting in a house at Hyannisport that she had run for 50 years, and there was almost no one left alive who had seen the parts she had removed. In 1984, at the age of 94, Rose Kennedy had a stroke. It was severe. It took her speech and much of her mobility, and it did not kill her. She lived another 11 years in the house at Hyannisport, attended around the clock, unable to leave, and eventually unable to communicate in any reliable way. The parallel does not require pointing out. Her husband had spent his last 8 years in the same houses, in a wheelchair, without words, understanding what was said around him and unable to answer it. Her eldest daughter had spent 60 years in Wisconsin with a handful of words available to her. Now the woman who had outlived both of them, who had chosen every sentence of the record with such care, was in a room in the same house on the same shoreline with the same faculty gone. She was brought downstairs for family occasions. Grandchildren came. Mass was said in the house. She was, by the accounts of those who visited, sometimes aware and sometimes not, and it was not always possible to tell which. In July 1990, the family held a 100th birthday celebration. There was a mass at St. Francis Xavier in Hyannis and a gathering of the family, and tributes were read. The Boston papers ran retrospectives. Ted spoke about his mother in public, and what he said was the account she had built: the faith, the discipline, the 9 children, the endurance. She was in the house, and she could not respond to any of it. In August 1993, there was a 103rd. In July 1994, a 104th. The tributes continued to be delivered to a woman who by then was almost entirely beyond reach. Rose Kennedy died on January 22, 1995, at Hyannisport of pneumonia. She was 104. The funeral was at St. Stephen's in Boston's North End, the church where she had been baptized in 1890, in the Italian and Irish quarter her father had organized. President Clinton spoke. Ted gave the eulogy. She was buried at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, beside her husband, a few streets from the house where she had raised the first 4 of her children with 1 bathroom. She had outlived 5 of her 9 children, her husband, her parents, 2 of her sons-in-law, and every person who had been present in 1913 when her father walked away from an election rather than let something be said out loud. She had not outlived Rosemary. Rosemary Kennedy was 76 when her mother died, and she was in Wisconsin, and she lived another decade. She died in January 2005 at 86 at a hospital in Fort Atkinson, with Eunice, Jean, Pat, and Ted at her bedside. She is buried at Holyhood, near her parents. The public accounting of what had been done to her arrived, in full, only after the deaths of everyone who had authorized it. The lobotomy was mentioned in books from the 1980s onward. The operating theater account came from Watts, decades on. The fuller reconstruction, drawing on institutional records and family papers, was published in the 2010s. Eunice's Special Olympics, founded in 1968 and now global, had been built on the fact of a sister without ever fully stating what had happened to her. When the story did become widely known, it was as an injustice done to Rosemary, which it was. And the more difficult question of who had known and when and what silence had cost was left largely where Rose had left it. There is a version of this life in which a woman survives everything and is admirable for it, and that version was constructed carefully, largely by the subject, and it is not false. The endurance was real. 9 children, 5 of them buried. A husband whose conduct was known to everyone, including her. 2 decades of public catastrophe absorbed in front of cameras. Whatever she was doing to make that possible, it worked. And she did it for 80 years without visible failure. There is another version in which the same faculty that made the endurance possible also made the silences possible, and the silences had a cost that fell on other people. The daughter in Wisconsin, the daughter buried in Derbyshire with no one from her family present, the children who learned early not to bring their mother their unhappiness and grew into adults who carried things they could not say. Both versions are supported by the record, and the record is the one she assembled. That is the part that lingers. She began keeping diaries as a girl, before there was anything to conceal. She kept letters and carbons and cards through decades in which nobody was watching. When the country finally turned to look at the Kennedys, the archive was already 40 years old, already shaped, already consistent with itself, and there was no competing account because she had been the only one taking notes. Whether that was the instinct of a woman who loved her family or the training of a girl who had watched her father survive by declining to answer, or something she never examined closely enough to name. The papers do not say, and she outlived everyone who might have. The convent at Blumenthal taught the girls that a rule kept when no one is watching is the only rule that counts. Rose Fitzgerald was 15 when she learned it, and she had wanted to go to Wellesley instead, and she mentioned that for the rest of her life. Everything else she kept. The papers are at Columbia Point in Boston, in the library her son did not live to see built and which she spent years helping to fund. Researchers work through them under the terms she set. The diaries are there, and the letters, and the campaign notes, and the round-robin bulletins she sent out to children scattered across boarding schools in the 1930s. Portions of the family's material stayed restricted for decades after her death. Historians have been unpicking it ever since, and what they have added is real. The operation, the arrangement of the marriage, the 20 years without a visit to Wisconsin. But the frame those corrections arrive inside is still the one she built. She remains the matriarch. The endurance is still the headline. The revisions get absorbed as details. There is an irony in that which she may or may not have anticipated. She spent her life being defined by men who made decisions about her. A father who sent her to a convent and then sent her back to her husband. A husband who moved her between 4 houses and authorized an operation while she was elsewhere. She is remembered now as the one who held it all together. What she actually did, and did better than any of them, was decide what the century would be told. The family kept producing events after 1995. Deaths, campaigns, scandals, a plane in the water off Martha's Vineyard 4 years later, and the language used to narrate them was substantially hers. Faith. Service. Bearing what comes. It has held up for 30 years past her death and shows no particular sign of failing. She was baptized in a church in the North End in 1890 and buried from the same church in 1995. In between, she was present for almost everything that happened to one of the most examined families in American life. And she said, on the record, almost exactly what she intended to say, and no more. Whether that was faith, or discipline, or a habit learned from a man who lost an election in 1913 rather than answer a question, there is no document that settles it. She kept everything. She chose what it would mean.